Welcome to the Contagious Code podcast, where we dive deep into code, learn practical skills, celebrate the beauty of engineering, and eliminate imposter syndrome. I'm Tejas Kumar, and I've been building on the web for over 20 years at places like Vercel, Spotify, Zeta, and more. Today, my guest is Jay V, the co-founder and CEO of SST.dev. SST is a platform where you can deploy applications to AWS just by writing TypeScript as code. It has significant advantages over things like Pulumi and Terraform and AWS CDK, Cloud Development Kit, which we go into detail a lot about today. Effectively, the pitch with SST is that it's a system where you can write TypeScript to deploy your Next.js or Astro or similar site to AWS, and then using TypeScript again, describe your infrastructure as code and deploy a backend component as well. Effectively, you go from idea to IPO rapidly. That's the claim, right? And so in our discussion with Jay, we discuss how exactly SST is able to achieve that. We contrast it with AWS CDK and Pulumi and Terraform and other components in this sphere. There's a great deep dive on how infrastructure as code helps developers ship things more reliably and more rapidly and more safely, I think, which is most important. Now, this deep dive is so special, and I'd love to offer this to all of you at zero cost because this is separate to my day job. And the way we can do that is through sponsors and partners. Let's take a moment to acknowledge them. The Contagious Code podcast is partnered with Code Crafters. Code Crafters is a site that teaches you how to code by having you re-implement tools that we use as developers every day in a programming language of your choice. So think about things like Redis or Docker or Git. How do they even work? Well, you get to build your own Redis, Docker, or Git in a language you prefer, JavaScript, Python, whatever. And in so doing, you learn the language better and you learn the tool better. They have a generous free tier, but should you start paying, you can get 40% off using the link in the show notes. That's tej.as/codecrafters. That conference just recently happened or is happening right now and is a great multidisciplinary family-first conference of tech, right? And it's really great. It's in a water park. People bring their families and they have some of the best keynotes. This conference happens twice a year, once in Wisconsin and once in Texas in the United States. And if you'd like to win a free ticket to go through our partnership, you can do that. Share this episode on social media, say you'd like to enter the raffle to win a ticket, and you will. Finally, the Contagious Code podcast is partnered with Stately.ai. Stately is a great way to build state charts and state machines that are visual representations of how state changes through your application, which you can then export to JavaScript and fill in the business logic for triggering a transition from state A to B. You can then unit test the state machine and it will forever just model the flow of state across your application. It's a great way to build robust, testable, reliable applications. They also have a framework called Stately Agent to put guardrails around large language models and create deterministic workflows with LLMs, especially agentic workflows. If you'd like to give any of that a try, go to stately.ai. Hey, thank you for sticking around. And now for my discussion with Jay V. Jay V, it's an honor, a privilege to have you on the Contagious Code podcast. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to talk about the serverless stack, SST. I've seen a ton of your content, especially from DAX on the internet, and I've always wondered about SST. I haven't used it myself, admittedly. I'd like to. I probably will after this, but I've seen it as sort of a way to build applications. So I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about it. But before we get into that, could you maybe do a little bit of an introduction to yourself for our listeners so that they get to know you and where you come from and what the company is and where that comes from as well?
Yeah. Do you want me to start with the company first or the founders, or where do you want to go?
This is your episode, whatever you want.
Let's start with the product. Yeah. So as you sort of said, it is a way to build applications. We're an open source framework for building applications on your infrastructure. So if you're using AWS, or Cloudflare, as we sort of added recently, or any of the other cloud providers, this deploys into your accounts essentially, and so it's self-hosted. We help you go from sort of, we say idea to IPO, but really what that means is we make it easy for you to get started with building an application and have ways where it neatly grows and scales as you grow and scale, both as the amount of traffic that your application or your product might be getting, all the way to, how your team is sort of growing and the complexity of the application that powers that as well. Our take on this as sort of product people has always been that we've made a distinction between things that are easy to get started versus things that are complicated in scale. We think that that isn't a right distinction, that, at the end of the day, we're working with code and you should be able to have abstractions that help you pull from something that's easy all the way to something that scales. That's us sort of on the product and kind of where we are. We launched in the early parts of sort of 2021, and this is after us being in the sort of serverless space for a while. So if I take you back a little bit, my co-founder Frank and I had been building a bunch of products all the way, since sort of AWS had launched.
Wow.
And it's just been the way that we've always sort of built sort of products. We've done sort of, things, that we're sort of hosting ourselves on our own servers, but effectively we've sort of grown up with the cloud. And so when serverless came along, or Lambda specifically came along, we looked at that and we went, wow, this is very clearly kind of the next step of how applications will be built, where we're slowly offloading more and more. If you look at the progression of cloud services in themselves, that's been the sort of trend, and this seemed like the natural sort of successor to that. And so this was back, I think, 2016, 2017 or so, where we were like, how do we show people how you can build a full application with it? Because Lambda back then, or as it had just sort of launched, was more just a concept of here's a function and here's some code that you can run. The concept that you could replace your sort of server-based applications with a bunch of Lambda functions was a little bit far-fetched early on, and so that was kind of the initial goal. And so we had built a guide on how to do this, just walking through people on how to build these applications. And I think that's kind of where the founding story really begins, is that when we put this guide together, the guide turned out to be some 600 pages long.
Wow.
It was absurd. I didn't want to write. It's funny. We're talking a little bit before. I wanted to go a little bit in depth. So I didn't want it to be kind of like a hello world thing. And so it was, what's sort of the basics of a SaaS application, go through the whole thing. And it turns out it's incredibly complicated because serverless and AWS, once you sort of get into it, sure, you're offloading the infrastructure sort of responsibilities to the cloud provider, but at the same time, you're offloading a lot of the other knowledge that you have as well. So now, instead of you learning how to do things inside your Express application or your Ruby on Rails application, you need to learn how AWS does the sort of plumbing between certain services. And so that ends up being really complicated, and that's kind of where the journey began. It was just a start from that point to kind of where we are now, to can we simplify this whole thing so that you have this ultimate promise that it's both easy to get started and scales all the way as you grow.
That's so good. I have so much respect for that, because there's a lot of similar serverless offerings that show you these really impressive demos, like, hey, run this one command and then it's live. And they stop there. They don't continue with like, okay, but what does it look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now? What happens when you get acquired by a hyperscaler and you have to like integrate into their virtual cloud, right? So I love that it's not just start great, but scale great. You also said it wasn't really inspired by the pain of wiring the different like AWS components, or in this case, even now we've moved to Cloudflare components together. And you believe, SST believes, this pain shouldn't exist. I've heard a similar story from Brandon Bayer from Flight Control. Almost exactly the same. AWS is very difficult to use as a single or a small team. Can we talk about that? Like, how close to Flight Control is SST? And how do you, I know you all do a lot of things differently. Where are some of those differences?
Yeah, I think the big thing here is, when we sort of rewind a little bit, it became fairly clear at some point that AWS is extremely powerful. You can build the largest companies on there. Yeah, sometimes like you might have to grow out of them, but given sort of like their earnings reports recently, it's quite clear they're doing fairly well. But then there was this concern of, hey, this is just so complicated. There's just so many things to do, and you have to get these AWS certifications, and so there was a rush of, I think, companies being like, well, we should try and make this simpler. And the obvious thing is, let's make it in ways that developers understand. So AWS gives you these services that are specific infrastructure services, but developers don't think in those terms. Developers think in terms of, I want to host my Next.js app. I want to host my Express app. I want a database, as opposed to the sort of nuts and bolts of what it takes to kind of run those services or run those frameworks or applications on AWS. And so, flight control is, I guess the predecessor to flight control would be, the kind of these, the renders, the railways, even Heroku's of the world, where it's being built into, or it's built on top of AWS, but you as a user are not using the underlying infrastructure, you're using their infrastructure. And obviously there's a cost attached to that, and there's been the whole thing of like, it's if you're going to use one of these services, it's going to be a lot more expensive. And so flight control's take is look, we can do that, but in your own account for a lot cheaper or a lot more cost effectively. You get to go direct. You're not using the quote unquote middleman. And we sort of share a lot of those values in that, as I sort of alluded, like ours is also self-hosted. So when you use our stuff, you're using your AWS account. You're not using our AWS account or our infrastructure. We help you wire it up. So, you can tell us, I want an Next.js app or I want an Express app, and we'll do kind of the plumbing for that. But at the end of the day, this is running in your account. So that's sort of the similarities. The differences, and the big one really is, I'm trying to pinpoint sort of the year here. I would say it's, I guess, 2020 or sort of somewhere around there when this thing called CDK happened in the AWS world. So this was a shift from writing YAML and JSON to configure this infrastructure, right? Like, again, like we're doing the plumbing for you. So this underneath it all, it's, let's say, YAML and JSON, to writing it in TypeScript or in a bunch of other languages. And what that did was, and then that is kind of what led to us sort of starting SST in some ways, was that it lets you abstract it in a way that works well for developers. Now, all of a sudden, you're working with real code as opposed to just configuration files. These configuration files, when you have a lot of them, they just, they don't scale in complexity. So a good example of this is like, let's say you and your friend are starting a company together and you're in charge of wiring up some of these things. You can create a component for him that he can use, again, inside the company, and he's not exposed to some of the things that you're doing, as long as that, it's written, let's say, in TypeScript or in a programming language that you and him, they're like, you're both familiar in. Whereas if it was written in YAML and JSON, it's just a bunch of configuration files that he sort of looks at. And it's very hard for somebody that is let's say, cloud native or isn't a cloud expert to be like, okay, what do I go change in here? And I think that was sort of the dramatic shift. And that's really what it comes down to. So when we look at something like flight control or some of these other services, at the end of the day, the configuration falls down to some sort of a configuration file. Right now, when you look at their stuff, it looks relatively simple. It makes a lot of sense because they're sort of starting out. But as you sort of grow and as you get sort of enterprise customers, let's say, they're going to ask for properties or specific sort of configurations that are a lot more complicated than what you have now, and managing that becomes really hard. And in our case, we do it a little bit differently. So it's the YAML JSON versus sort of the TypeScripts of the world.
Well, how do you do it differently? How do you do it? This is fun. So when we had sort of sat down to kind of look at this, like the thought that I had was, the goal again is, you're taking somebody that's relatively new. So when you look at deploying a Next.js app with us, it is, like 3 lines of code or 1 line of code, whatever. It's like new Next.js, right? Wow. You point it to wherever the directory is. And so that's relatively straightforward. And that could work in the YAML world the same way as it would work in the TS world, right? It's just 1 line. Now you're like, okay, I want to change how much memory one of the functions that underlies the Next.js app takes, right?
And so in the case of kind of the YAML world, it's like, all right, there's a little more configuration that you're adding. In the TS world, probably something similar. What happens after a while is as you start tweaking these pieces of config, the YAML one, just starts to grow. To a point that when, let's say, you add a new developer to your team and they are like, I want to make a change to our Next.js config or how it's deployed, they're staring at a really large file.
Yeah.
Whereas in the case of the TS one, if it's gotten to a point where it's gotten really large, so let's say you're doing a bunch of stuff with one of the functions, you can abstract it out to a point that, to a new person, they're just looking at like, oh, I've got like an adapter that I'm calling. It's just a single function call. I'm not interested in that one. I'm interested in a different one. So it gives you, the crux of the argument is that there are ways to deal with complexity that we know how to do in code, as in, sort of TS or JS, whatever.
Yeah.
But it's a lot harder to do when it comes to YAML and JSON. And why don't we take advantage of the tools that we already have when it comes to dealing with complexity, applying that to infrastructure? So, that's, even though we use the term infrastructure as code and it's been used for the sort of YAML and JSONs of the world, it's really, it really shines when you actually use it in code as opposed to just config files.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. Absolutely. I think the fact that you can do this with TypeScript is a game changer because TypeScript has modules. So like you said, you could abstract things away and have I don't know how much memory your Lambda consumes as your example, as just one export somewhere, if I understand correctly, right? And then it becomes very simple. I have a question about a number of things. Mainly, you mentioned like on SST, things get plumbed together. So you run this command and point it at your Next.js directory and boom, you've got a TS file that models your infrastructure as code and then deploys Next.js. In terms of deploying Next.js using SST, by plumbing things together, do I understand correctly that Next.js functions or API routes then get deployed on Lambda and static builds get deployed on S3 and like everything goes where it should, so to speak, on AWS? Is that what SST does under the hood?
Yeah. This is, I guess a year and a half ago, maybe, I think we launched this project called Open Next, and that's basically bringing a bunch of the communities that were working on Next.js deployments on AWS together to have this sort of effort of doing this. And this is a whole sort of can of worms here, but on the Next.js side, there is sort of the official way you do it through Vercel. There's the other official way if you wanted to self-host, which would be through a container. The container has a bunch of limitations, and most importantly, does not function the way it functions on Vercel. The Open Next and what SST does as well is sort of trying to model that. So pretty much what you said. It is a fairly complicated architecture just because of the way Next.js is, but yeah, that's what we try and do. And there's some downsides with this. So this isn't like, it's not a silver bullet that like it works perfectly for a lot of people, but it gives you a lot more control than if you were using Vercel, which ends up being kind of the differentiating factor for us and some of the enterprises that use us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can understand the complexity there because it's many different moving parts. And I think this would also scale in complexity with supporting other frameworks. For example, Solid Start, Astro, Quick, each one of them have a notion of like serverless functions and long-running dev servers. What I've seen some lesser products, put it that way, do is they'll do the same infrastructure as code style work as SST, but when you go to deploy it, they'll put it in an EC2 or Fargate instance and just start the dev server and expose that through the network. And so what you basically get when you go visit a domain is a dev server running in the cloud.
Yep.
I'm glad to know that SST doesn't do that. Speaking of infrastructure as code, I've spent quite a bit of time in that space as well, mostly with Terraform. And that was also a composability nightmare with HCL, the HashiCorp programming language. So I appreciate the work that's going into this. I think there was a time where a huge problem I faced in the IAC or infrastructure as code space was where my config files, so my HashiCorp files, were out of sync with the underlying AWS service, right? Because of either me or someone on my team, we didn't change the infrastructure by pushing code. somebody went to the AWS console and just changed like the status of an EC2 instance, for example, and then there was a mismatch, and this was a nightmare. In the event that that happens with SST, what would that workflow look like?
Yeah, I think there are some tools. Candidly, we moved to, we used to use CDK. CDK is the one that I sort of mentioned. Now we do a combination of Pulumi and Terraform, but it's more just sort of Pulumi sort of deploying these things, and it has these things called like these bridge providers, which are basically Terraform providers, but in TS. And so we do that.
Nice.
We haven't quite gotten to this state just yet. So I think we haven't faced as much of this specific issue that you're mentioning, primarily because a lot of our users just use AWS through us, right? Like they're, it's almost like they don't try and do the two modes. Like, I think if something really goes wrong, you might end up going to the AWS console and poking around, but yeah, things like drift detection, like figuring out that something is off, that is something that's a little bit more on the roadmap for us. It just hasn't come up a whole lot yet, but yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, I respect that. The way we solved it was to just cut off everyone's AWS access also, and then there is no way to do that. Okay, you mentioned shifting away from CDK to Pulumi and Terraform. Yeah. I'd like to talk about that a little bit. For those who are listening who don't know what CDK is, it's Cloud Development Kit, right, from AWS. Right. It's a way of writing your infrastructure as code in TypeScript. Why did you shift from CDK? What shortcomings were there in CDK? And really, what I'm trying to get here is technical reasons and takeaways for people listening who are maybe facing the same thing in their company.
Yeah, I can share our post on this because this was a big shift. So historically, we had started with CDK, and then I'd say September of last year or maybe October, we made the decision to sort of move away, and the new version of SST, which we call Ion, is the one that's out right now, and that's using Pulumi and sort of Terraform underneath. There's a bunch of reasons. Sort of entertainingly, this post, and I can send you the link after, was written after sort of years of frustration. So for listeners that might not know, CDK is it's a way to write CloudFormation, but in TypeScript. But the way it works is in TypeScript or many other languages. But the way it works is sort of fascinating. It's not that it's directly controlling or creating your resources. So say for example, in CDK, you go in and you say, I want to create a new bucket. CDK is not creating the bucket. CDK, when you compile it, it generates CloudFormation JSON. So JSON's back in the picture again, right?
Yeah.
And then that gets fed to CloudFormation, the service, which is in AWS, and that runs, in a bit of a black box. So like you feed it this template, and then that service goes off and creates all the sort of underlying infrastructure. And you can kind of see as like a, as sort of a programmer, you can almost immediately tell there's something off about this picture in that you're sort of abstracted away, a couple of layers away from the actual problem. And you can think, well, what happens if the bucket fails to create for some reason? Well, the error has to be bubbled up all the way through now. And it turns out they don't bubble it up all the way through well.
Oh my goodness.
So immediately you run into sort of an issue. But there are some other subtle things. So now because your TypeScript is generating JSON, some very basic things. Actually, this is not a subtle one. This is the more basic one, is that if you just did a console log on a value that you're expecting, so the bucket name, the bucket has been created, give me the bucket name, you can't get it because your TS isn't creating the bucket, right? It's going to generate the JSON that will then go create the bucket. So what they do is they give you these sort of like placeholders almost that get filled in later on. So what you will get is, again, what you're not expecting, which isn't like a terrible thing. It's a gotcha. You get over it pretty quickly. But the subtle things are there's some types of modeling that you will do in your TS code which cannot be reflected in JSON. And that's where the mental model breaks. So you come in thinking, I'm just writing code that creates infrastructure, and you're like, well, okay, I guess it doesn't really create the infrastructure, but it should be the same. And so you're just writing normal code, and then you get into these pickles, I guess. And so that's one of the class of problems, is that people are expecting certain things to happen in TypeScript, and they don't happen the way they should, because again, it's not actually creating the infrastructure.
Yeah.
The second class is, and this has been an issue. If you're a Terraform user, or if you've done some stuff on AWS, there's been sort of the holy war between Terraform and CloudFormation for a really long time, and CloudFormation is fundamentally the big difference from Terraform is that it runs on AWS, and so you don't get to see how these things are created. You don't get to see the state file, and when things go wrong, it tends to get into these states where you're just stuck, and you basically. You just have to be like, okay, AWS, can you fix this? Or like, I just have to delete it. Whereas at least in the Terraform case, again, it's not all roses, but in the Terraform case, the state file is with you. Like, you can look at it, you can see what's sort of happening, and yeah, you do get into pickles as well. But like, it's not it's not sort of a black box that CloudFormation is. So at kind of a high level, that's what it is. And yeah, so we I took a bunch of time, wrote this post. I was really angry. It took me like a week to write it, because I was just rewrites and rewrites and rewrites. And then eventually, even after I wrote it, I think we did get some pushback, but it's completely fair, because I was taking a shot at a product that a lot of other people like,
Yeah.
And I guess I should sort of clear here, a lot of these frustrations are not us as just direct users of CDK or CloudFormation. It's that we're framework authors. So
Yeah.
we're creating something for other people, and we're giving you this promise as a user, let's say, that when you go try it, you're going to have a great experience. And when you don't, we have to sort of answer for it on some level. We can't just be like, oh, that's just CDK CloudFormation. And that's what we were doing for 2 years. But eventually, at some point, we're like, we have to stop doing that, and we have to actually build something better. So
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for that detailed nuance, and we will put a link to the blog post that you angrily wrote in the show notes.
Yeah.
You mentioned the state file. Just for those listening who aren't familiar, what this is Terraform. When you deploy infrastructure with Terraform, it will save the state of your infrastructure wherever you want, including in an S3 bucket, right? So you just, the state of like, I have this database and that container and this Route 53 domain, it just like makes a big list of all of this and stores it somewhere. And with Terraform, you can see that, you can keep it with you. That's what you mentioned, but with CDK not. I appreciate that. One question I had here was about, SST, and how, I guess it's different then because it's TypeScript. That's what I'm not seeing. So the state file in this scenario, where does it live? Is it hosted on SST or?
Yeah, it's the same as sort of I guess Terraform, but we automate something for you. So it runs locally, but then we sync it with an S3 bucket in your AWS account. So if you've got multiple people on your team, it's being synced to the same thing, and we sort of handle it that way. We are kind of very clear on that. If you're using us, because we're open source and self-hosted, most of the stuff should run in your account.
Yeah, you mentioned some things that give me and the listeners an idea that you're a pretty technical founder / co-founder or founder. Which one is it?
Yeah. So it's Frank and I. We're sort of the founders. Dax joined a little bit later. At this point, he's basically a founder. So it's the three of us, I guess.
Yeah. And so you're a technical founder because you mentioned console log, and you mentioned you built this and you felt the pain. I'm curious, day to day, is that something you do as a CEO of SST? Like, are you hands on with the code as well as trying to fundraise and run the business? What does a day look like?
Yeah, it's shifted a bit, definitely over the years. I think when we had first started SST, one of the other, so there were really like two big things that got us some traction early on. It was sort of the two big bets that we'd made. One was the CDK, this way of writing infrastructure in real code, and it's solving a pain point in a way that some of these other YAML JSONs could not do. And the other one was this thing called Live Lambda. So it allows you to run your Lambda functions locally, where it like proxies the request from AWS into your computer and sends it back. And it's like this magical experience for people that are working in serverless. I like to take credit for that idea. So there's the original idea I think I sort of came up with. I think the very early implementation, I think Frank might have done it, and then I sort of done a version after that. So a lot of the early sort of SST like like the version 1 sort of code base was started by me, and then Frank did a lot of the infrastructure pieces themselves. Like he's really good at just understanding how some of these things work. And then I think version 2 onwards, so for SST, it was pretty much DAX. And so these days I don't do a ton on the actual framework, but I do write a lot of the docs, the tutorials, the sample apps. I think the way at least my role has sort of evolved is I think of it more in terms of there is things that are really close to the user and there are things that are really far away from the user. So there's obviously like the fundraising stuff that you sort of mentioned. So some of the setting sort of the direction of the company, or like figuring out what we're working on and like what's kind of the priorities are, and just like getting everybody on the same page and just thinking about the team quite a bit. That is a big part of what I do. And then a lot of the other things are just like support, docs, examples, spending time as close to the user as possible. So the actual sort of like building out the framework, I haven't done a whole lot of that sort of recently. But yeah, it's awesome. Just the way things have evolved.
Yeah. Let's pull on the thread of your serverless experience a little bit, because as you mentioned, this is what you were playing with before.
Yeah.
SST even was a thing. Nowadays, there's a lot of founders, a lot of CTOs, and it's interesting because like I've been doing DevRel in a consulting fashion for various startups and also larger companies. And sometimes the large company folks, the decision makers, they hear the word serverless and they go like, oh, no, but can I do Kubernetes? That's always the question. Can I run Kubernetes on this? We talked to Brandon Bayer from Flight Control, and he keeps getting from potential customers like, can I run EKS? Can I do Kubernetes? Everybody wants to do Kubernetes. Fun fact, we have a bus service provider here in Germany called Flixbus, and they're heavy into Kubernetes. They don't know why, but their builds are very high. So it has this reputation among some developers who embrace serverless as being like this thing that's too expensive that you probably don't need. I'm curious if you could maybe speak to that. And then after, I want to get into your post. You posted on X about Next.js is the Kubernetes of front end. I want to understand that in more detail.
There's some fun bits there. But so I think when we had started, we were definitely in the camp of, look, you should be using managed services as much as possible, and we try to steer you in that direction as much as we can. Mostly because we want to stand up things that, when it comes to infrastructure, that you don't have to worry about. And so now you've got, when it first started, yes, it was just Lambda that could kind of do that, but now we're seeing all the other flavors of services as well that are turning to be maybe not 100% sort of managed like Lambda, but fairly close. So you've got, Fargate for containers, and our goal, I think we had started with just purely serverless, especially with some of the Terraform stuff that we put out more recently, and also some of the Cloudflare things that we have. We've definitely gone in the direction of you should be able to build anything with us. And so this the fun fact here, I guess, there was recently the thing that Dax, Adam, Prime, and TJ worked on with their coffee shop through SSH. That's something that you can is built through SST, and it ended up being one of the things that sort of pushed us to really support the container story really well. And so we've had that piece for a little bit, but maybe not full fledged, and so that's another thing that we're kind of doing. I think even in that, though, we do try and make the distinction between managed containers and just running your own Kubernetes cluster. And so we're kind of drawing the line there, and maybe that might change in the future. But at least for now, it's what are the best bits of AWS that you can get, or Cloudflare that you can get, where you don't have to worry about the underlying infrastructure as much as possible, while still being able to do pretty much anything. And Kubernetes is maybe a little bit further out from where we are, but like standing up a cluster of containers, that should be something we should be able to help you do.
If I can interrupt here, a lot of our listeners don't fully understand like when someone would reach for Kubernetes. Because a lot of the listeners play in that serverless space. And so Kubernetes is sort of this bad word where people go like, when is the time? When do we reach for it? So could you, I mean, you're pretty experienced in this space. Could you maybe speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the point that you would sort of reach for, and we've talked to definitely a few teams that do this, is where you're large enough to the point where your platform team has a really good sense of the infrastructure that your company needs sort of moving forward. And so you're effectively managing a Heroku or a render railway internally. And to build one of those, you would need something like Kubernetes.
Right.
And there's like nothing that gives you kind of the flexibility and the power that Kubernetes does, which is why it has such a draw, right? Is that you feel just you feel like you get pretty much anything that the that cloud provider can offer, but also you can move that to any other cloud provider, whenever you want. And maybe you run it hybrid. You've got all these options that untie you from what AWS is selling you or whoever is sort of selling you. And this is something that matters to much larger organizations that again, like, once you sort of get to that scale is maybe a thing that you sort of worry about where you've got a team that's able to do that. I think our contention, I guess, on some level is that, you evolve as a company because an option like that sort of exists, or that there weren't many other better options. And I guess we're kind of betting that eventually you don't end up reaching for a Kubernetes if you've got a really good setup and you don't have a separate team that manages your sort of platform internally.
Awesome. Thank you for that. You mentioned about this coffee shop. That's Terminal Coffee. You can only buy it through the command line.
Yeah.
If I was to build that, I would build it with Lambda because as far as I can see, right, command line code it lends itself very well to Lambda. Meaning you run a command, you invoke a Lambda on the other side. It's pretty event driven. I'm curious why you needed to improve the container story for
Yeah,
that.
I mean, to be fair, like you should be asking them about this, but but on our side, yeah. So what they're doing is that you can SSH into it. So it's like a server that you
Oh,
SSH into. Yeah. If it
oh
was just
wow.
commands, yeah, that would yeah. I think Lambda would sort of make sense for that one. Um, it's funny because it's like yeah, we have to sort of obviously yeah, you kind of need containers for that, but it's funny because it allows us to kind of show that yeah, you could build these very non-traditional apps, let's call it,
Yeah, yeah.
with SST as well. But yeah, it's. I think there's this version of this where, for your listeners and a lot of their audience as well, is that they get to play with technologies that they maybe don't play with all the time, and so something like SSH
Yeah.
and being able to power that seems fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that I actually have been working on some in my free time some agentic AI workflows
Yeah.
that require long running servers because you tend to have two large language models sort of competing and then running tools and all of this stuff can take much longer than, for example, a Lambda's execution timeout.
Yeah.
And so that looks like something I'd like to try SST for, and including the podcast search actually for this podcast. I don't know if you've seen, but our listeners have the ability to go on tage.as and
Oh wow.
type in any query, and it will search every episode with every conversation ever, and give them the exact timestamp with the right guest, actually a list of them. And if they click on the timestamp, they get taken, boom, to that moment in time. So,
Wow.
for example, if somebody types in CloudFormation on tage.as,
Yeah.
they'll come to the point in time where you said CloudFormation, and they'll hear about your answer. So anyway, that's a long
Wow, how
running
did you build
service.
that sounds really fascinating.
Oh, it's actually not that complicated. What we do is we take transcripts of everything. So after
Yeah.
we're recording this, some AI agents will actually turn this whole thing into text and then load it into a vector database. And so when somebody enters a query, we do a quick similarity search. This is called RAG, Retrieval Augmented
Yep.
Generation. And then we'll pull
Nice.
it, we'll feed it to some large language model and output the result. But the secret sauce is linking the timestamps from the YouTube version to, and that is just because the transcripts are SRT files. They have timestamp information. So we just literally tell GPT-4 like write an anchor link, and YouTube allows you to jump to the timestamp. So we ran an anchor link $T equals the second offset. It's not hard. It's just nobody
Yeah,
does
wow.
it because nobody thinks in that
Yeah,
term, I
yeah.
guess. On
Is that open source,
usability.
by the way?
It's not, but I have a YouTube video on how to do
cool.
it. That specific code is not. But anyway,
Okay.
I will look forward to using SST for my AI agent workflows because this is there's a lot of unrealized potential using agents with OpenAI specifically, because the SDK even gives you the possibility to run tools in a loop if you want, without being too expensive. Anyway, that's not why we're here. But thank you. I'm very excited to explore SST there. Okay, let's continue to pull on this. I asked you, why is Next.js the Kubernetes of front end? I still don't get it. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so there's two sides to this. There is, you as a Next.js user, you get, just out of the box, you get all of this functionality. And this is sort of timely because I think there's a shift. I'm sort of alluding to it a little bit, but like there's a shift coming in sort of the React ecosystem a little bit. Next.js is a framework that is sort of batteries included. So, it comes with almost every sort of feature that you would want at this point, and they're obviously building on more. A bunch of them are turned on by default, and it's an experience that the framework authors in this case and Vercel have deemed sort of the standard that you would want when you run a React SSR app for the first time. And this involves a lot of caching. This involves patching fetch, or maybe not patching into the future, things like that. And there's a lot that's going on that as a new user you're not necessarily aware of. You don't need to be aware of it to be completely honest. It's just when things go wrong, then you have to kind of dig in. You have to be like, oh, what happened? And you have to learn about these concepts. Yeah. The old React model with create React app and then with Vite used to be the other way. That. So it's like, right? It's like, you can almost think of it, it's like flipping the pyramid. Like you start sort of at the bottom and then you work your way up. Whereas with Next.js, you come with everything and then you figure it out over time. And so there's a difference in philosophies there. And then that's from a user's perspective. The tweet, though, is a little tongue-in-cheek because it's not from the user's perspective. It's from a person that has to deploy, like in our case, has to deploy one of these things. So when we deploy, like you had mentioned, there's Solid, there's Astro, there's Remix. When we deploy them, the deployment looks a lot simpler than Next.js. And again, it's because of this like slight difference is that Next.js has all of these features and you kind of get them out of the box, or like you're expecting to get them out of the box. So a deployment for a Next.js app, if we were to kind of map it out in terms of all of the resources that it takes, and I think we've done a count of this, and I forget if it was, I'm trying to remember the exact number. It was a few hundred. There were a few hundred resources required to deploy a Next.js app, a serverless Next.js app on AWS. And if you map that out, it looks like Kubernetes to me. So that's what the joke was.
Wow, I would love to see that map, man. If y'all did that internally, that's something that I would eat up if it was ever released. Just a big, right. You know what I'm thinking of? I'm thinking of the It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia guy meme with the board and the.
That's exactly what it is. That is literally what it is. That is literally what it feels like doing Next.js on AWS, and it's not fun.
This is the moment where somebody listening or watching the podcast will comment on and say things like, "See, that's why Vercel is evil, because they want to make their thing really hard to deploy everywhere." Right.
I mean, again, to be fair, like Vercel's whole thing is that they've created this very specific infrastructure to run this in the most optimal way possible, and then kudos to them, right? Like that's not easy to do. Now, if you have to self-host that's painful, and that's that's sort of what the joke is. Yeah,
but I mean, don't Astro and Quick and Solid and all these other ones also have similar? I mean, look, Next.js, as far as I know, the only difference it has is really ISR, or incremental static regeneration. But I'm naive. I have never deployed Next.js on AWS. But for me, like an outside incompetent observer, if we compare something like Quick and Next.js, gosh, Quick does this thing where it will strip out little closures, little functions, event listeners into its own bundle and then dynamically load it on demand. I have to assume that also requires some wacky configuration. No, but you mentioned the opposite. You mentioned things like Nuxt and Solid Start. They look sort of similar. So what are we missing here?
Yeah, there are a couple of things that happened. I think one is Next.js has a lot of baggage is sort of one word, but it has a lot of history. So you're coming through sort of Next 12 to Next 13 to Next 14. There are a bunch of changes that are being created, but at the same time, there's some level of like these older features that are still being supported in some ways. And that obviously means that, yeah, you have to actually support them, but these newer features are not starting from scratch. I think they're sort of the app router story allowed them to reset a little bit, but not enough to a certain degree. Whereas you see the Quicks of the world, the Astros, the remixes of the world, they're almost starting from scratch. So they get to sort of like start clean when it comes to kind of the SSR story. And that's one piece of it. Now, obviously, it like differs from framework to framework a little bit. But the other one is these other frameworks started to consolidate at some point. So a bunch of them sort of use Vite, and Vite sort of taken over kind of like the sort of bundling story a little bit, and how they actually get deployed might be a little bit different. But a good example of this is we're about to support Solid and Solid Start and Nuxt in Ion, and that requires us to support. I think it's Nitro, and I'm not. This is more sort of frank, but that allows us to do both of them together. So we get like literally in our code base, there are a bunch of like SSR primitives that we have that, like 80 to 90% of it works for everybody else, and then there's a bunch of like special stuff for Next, and that's where I think the differences sort of show up. I think if Next sort of did like a rewrite where they didn't have to do a bunch of like old things and sort of like historical support, they would probably be a lot cleaner as well. So there's, but then again, there's like philosophically they want to be batteries included too. So.
Of course. Yeah, it's the curse of longevity on the web, right? You have things like JavaScript, which is super old, but type of null is object, for example. Right. Or you have things like React that still supports class components because it has to. And by its design cannot adopt like more fine-grained reactive primitives like signals because it's just against its rendering model. With age, I see that. Thanks for clarifying that. I can't imagine what the source code of like modern JavaScript engines must look like, because those have been running for 20 plus years, and gosh, all the if branches and so on. Incredible. So SST is a company. It literally stands for Serverless Stack, SST, right?
It's a running joke. At this point, we've got no comment. We don't know what it means anymore.
Yeah.
But yeah, historically, the domain was actually like serverless-stack.com, and we're like, that's way too long. Let's find something shorter. And then eventually we sort of got SST and then the domain itself. And at this point, it's, that's what we tell people when they ask us, what does it mean?
It just means something. It seems like the company and the product, the framework is, as we've been talking about for like 45 minutes, is geared towards serverless. Serverless is the preferred way. And by that, I don't mean, functions. I mean, the server doesn't exist to you. You don't care about the server. Yeah. What are some cases where serverless is maybe not the best way? So some pitfalls that if you adopt serverless, you're going to run into these issues, and you're probably better actually like reasoning about the concept of a server in your business.
Yeah, I think there are sort of two classes. The obvious one is sort of performance. So if there comes a point where you know exactly what your workload looks like, it's very predictable. It's probably always on, which is kind of what matters here because it's a server. Then there are going to be some cost considerations when it comes to sort of what you get out of that performance, right? Like if I wanted something that it doesn't have sort of cold starts, needs to sort of respond to every request very predictably, and again, like I know what my traffic sort of looks like, the performance can kind of map out in a way that the cost model of Lambda just won't make sense. In that case, you probably want to switch to using sort of containers. And again, we do sort of support containers as well, but as we sort of mentioned before, maybe you go up a step even further where you're like, oh yeah, I want to run this completely internally, and so you end up with sort of Kubernetes at that point. But yeah, that's one area. The other one I think that comes up a little bit is Lambda and even some of the other sort of deployment models. They make certain assumptions on what you can kind of run. Like in the case of Lambda, it's like, the runtime has certain restrictions. And when you hit those, maybe you get to a point where you're building something non-traditional where you're hitting that a little too much and you're just like, you know what, I just want to eject out of this. And so that's another case where it makes a lot of sense to not use serverless.
Interesting. recently there was a discussion on X, formerly Twitter, right, where I think it was Levels.io, just said none of you need any of this stuff. I have a
Right.
Hetzner machine. It's just a physical machine, and it works. Why are you all paying so much for Vercel and Cloudflare? Could you speak to that? I mean, it's probably better on SST, right? Because you still use AWS infrastructure, so
Right.
that cost element. Because I know Vercel, you pay double what you would pay AWS. They take 100% margin
Yeah.
for admittedly quality service. It is.
Yeah.
I will say this: Vercel's products are the best products in web dev, no
Right.
question. From Next.js to the hosting platform, it's just always good and polished. And for me, it's honestly a premium I consider worth paying for
Right.
because of that. But yeah, if there was someone who wanted to just do the bare metal thing, what trade offs, what caveats would you give them?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of versions of this one as well. There's the argument that usually comes up with this is, look, I know exactly what I need.
Yeah,
I know exactly what my requirements are, and I know this for, let's say, the next year or two, or some period of time. Like, I know the kind of business that I'm in. It's, again, very predictable. If you have a very good sense of that, and you have a very good sense of sort of the scope, and you know, and you're very comfortable with a specific tool, you should use that specific tool, right? So in this case, I think, yeah, like, yeah, if you know, like, what you're looking for, like in this case, in the tweet that he had, that makes total sense. I don't think you should be, like, swayed away from that. Our thing, if you sort of rewind a little bit, is this: our target audience are folks that are sort of, day one to day 1,000. So, like,
yeah,
idea to IPO. So this is a case where you're potentially going to turn into a hyperscaler at some point, or you're potentially going to go through a period of growth that is going to force you to make certain product choices based on the engineering choices that you had previously made. And that can be really painful. And that is a thing that you definitely don't want to go through, is that,
yeah,
and again, this is knowing that you're in this business, right? Like, we're not saying, hey, I get lucky and then I run into this issue. But a lot of founders, like, they get into it because they want to build that type of company. And if you want to build that type of company, you know, why are you running it out of one box, right? Like, why not pick something that allows you to experiment and grow as your company evolves? And so there's this sort of, like, a lot of these arguments kind of boil down into, like, their viewpoint makes sense for their use case. If you're in their use case, you should probably use their thing, or whatever tool you're familiar with. But again, like, if you're looking to sort of grow a little bit, or if you're going to have changing requirements, then you probably should pick the most flexible model.
awesome. I this is why this podcast exists. It's so great to capture all of this detail because
Right.
there's so many people who just swear by one model or the other, like
Right.
Levels.io.
Right.
And this adds to the discussion. I thank you so much for sharing that. Y'all put out some. Actually, frankly, I think your whole messaging of like, what is it to IPO?
Oh,
You
idea to
just said it.
IPO. Yeah.
Idea to IPO. That's so cool. Superbase has one. What is it? Start in a weekend, scale to millions.
Right.
Everybody has this thing. We had an episode with Brandon from Flight Control who mentioned, as a technical founder, that the technical stuff is easy. Building the software is easy. It comes natural because he's a technical founder, as you are. And he mentioned the hardest problem with having a startup like Flight Control or SST is the positioning and messaging. Do you agree with that statement? Has that been something y'all have found particularly difficult, or has the messaging just been on point from day one?
Yeah, I think we do have a take on this. It's the way we kind of think about this one is the sort of marketing messaging, the outward facing is very much tied to what the product is. So the general sort of advice that we give sort of other folks when it comes to something like this is that if you're having a hard time with messaging, positioning, it's probably the product that needs to be sort of changed. It's like saying, like, some things are just naturally more marketable than others.
Yeah.
And also, it matters if, what industry you're in. There are boring industries, of course, that are maybe not so marketable, though, again, marketing is a lot more fun than most people give credit for. When we look at some of the stuff that we have done, we always think about like when it comes to building a product, what is the hook here? Like, why would, when we announce this on Twitter, when we tell anybody about this, why would they care about this? And
Yeah.
that has to be in terms of like something they care about in their world as opposed to in our world, right? And so that bit needs to be immediately tied to what the product does, and those two are not. It's like, I guess that maybe the best analogy here is it's like two sides of a coin. Like I'm seeing one side, our users are seeing the other.
Yeah.
And if I'm struggling with positioning, it's because I need to pick a different coin. Like it's not that like I have to like move certain things around. It's that, yeah, they're seeing it differently, but we're actually looking at the same thing. And so, so that's the way I think we look at it. But yeah, I think in general, I do agree with the point that as technical co-founders, I think we tend to maybe like, undersell or undervalue the positioning, marketing, or like the outward facing stuff.
Your team has done some really great stuff. In fact, the first time I heard of SST was by a talk from Dax at React Miami 2022, I believe.
Yeah,
it was
maybe,
2022.
yeah. I guess, is that the T-shirt? Was that one, or is it different?
No, I'm currently wearing the 2023 one.
Okay.
But I've gone every year since the first, except this year. This year, it's always on my wife's birthday. And this year, she was like, "Can we do something except React Miami?" And so, understandably so.
I don't understand. What is the problem here?
Yeah, exactly. Don't you like Miami? No, but okay. So you'll do this public stuff. I think it's really great. Dax has a show. I think it's called Between Two Devs. Hilarious. But you also make courses, and this is what I wanted to talk to you about. A few months ago, I saw a mini course on, admittedly now it's maybe outdated, CDK and SST. You'll make these mini courses. Has that shown value? I guess that's the question. And I'm asking because I do DevRel. I've done DevRel for years. And the question we keep coming back to is like, does any of that matter? Does it move the needle? Does it create qualified leads? How do you even measure ROI on such activities?
Yeah, it seems fascinating.
I mean, maybe the answer is you don't even do it, right? It's just, I don't know. I go to Miami because I like it, and maybe something positive will happen. I've heard that too, and that's fine.
Right. Wait. So yeah. I guess just to clarify here, are you like you mentioned Miami here? Are you talking about like some of the conference stuff, or like the courses, or like the content, educational content?
Well, yeah, both. I think both come under a similar umbrella as DevRel activities. Whether it's Dax doing education as a talk, or a course to teach people about things. Both of them, I have to assume for a for-profit company is okay. Good. Maybe devs this will resonate with them, and they'll become our advocates internally at their company, and then we'll get new customers. I might be completely off on the motivation here, but that's sort of what I've seen from this type of work.
Yeah. Yeah, that is interesting because I actually put it in two separate buckets here. Like the some of the educational stuff is we don't think about ROI as much. We think about it in terms of, so like for us it's they're really just like three numbers that we play with, and again it's maybe a function of where we are as a company. It's how many new people are trying out SST, how many of them are sort of sticking around, and how many of them end up sort of paying, right? So it's fairly straightforward. The educational content falls in the middle one, which is, how many of them are sticking around. The stuff that, let's say the React Miami things or whatever we do on Twitter or the Between Two Nerds or like any of the content that sort of like Dax wants to create, that falls in the first bucket, which is like how many new people are trying out SST, and that shows up like fairly easily. It's like, yeah, like how much engagement are we sort of driving on content like that, and that'll show up like, once we have that, it'll show up in our numbers probably the next week or the week after, and then obviously like sort of sustained value too. So like it tends to compound, but the educational stuff, and I think this might be a function of how we had started, was we always looked at, because we had started originally with a guide, we had always looked at it from the perspective of we need to teach people how to build this. Like it's not enough that the product exists. You have to teach people. I think the most rewarding part of it, it's not truly ROI, but the most rewarding part is when we realize like we'll do a call, let's say with a user or a customer that's having some problems, and then they'll like share a little bit about their code base, and we'll realize it's based exactly on the guide.
Wow.
And we obviously use it internally, but there's also folks that have, built their companies on top of this, and they've taken it a lot further than you can kind of imagine. So that's not, sort of truly ROI in the dollar sense, but it's very rewarding when you're like, yeah, you know what, we've put people on the right path here.
That's incredible. It sounds like you've got a developer sales and marketing funnel, so to speak, with Dax between two nerds being the top of the funnel. How many new people can we get, like you said?
Yeah.
And the courses being the middle, right? Like, okay, there's new people, and I've seen from all of my DevRel work, signups do not equal users. Signups, honestly, they're almost a vanity metric, sort of like GitHub stars. Sure, I'll come sign up and try it out because it's low investment, but I'm probably not going to use it. So then that second step, the courses that help people stick around, that seems to have been working, as you mentioned. I'm wondering what other, I don't want to use the word tactics, but what other tools are you using? Because a question that keeps coming up on the podcast and in various discussions is, okay, I've got a lot of signups. Some influencer will do something and we'll get a spike,
Right.
but then they never stick around. So what has worked well for SST in that case, in addition to the courses?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a feedback loop here, and like the sign up point is kind of interesting, and I think we think about it this way as well, is that if you were, let's say you were sort of doing DevRel and you were just responsible for signups, that creates an odd incentive, right? Like,
Yeah, a false incentive,
right?
almost.
Like it should
Yeah.
be how many people eventually like stick around, right? Like eventually, like how many people
Yes.
are actually using our thing, and we would want the same team or the same person, to be in charge of both, or to be sort of thinking about both. It's not like it's not sort of separate in that sense. And the way we kind of do this is like we tie the person's identity to the thing that they're doing. So in this case, it's like your identity isn't signups. Your identity is SST, right? And which is why like we the way we sort of joke about like, or like the questions that Dax usually gets is like, hey, what's your role? Like, what do you actually do there? There is no sort
He's
of like
I
defined...
am SST.
Right, exactly. There's like that's like if SSC is doing bad, I feel bad, right? Like, it's
Right.
just, there aren't two ways sort of about it, but that's sort of one part, I think. In terms of tactics, I don't know how intentional this was, but I think over time what we've realized is we've cultivated a community / following, like, however you sort of want to phrase this, and this I think is important for frameworks more than SaaS products, is that, and you're probably familiar with this. There's like an oddly like religious element when it comes to framework wars, right?
Yeah.
And to be clear here, I'm not advocating that that's what you should be doing, but I'm just saying it's a thing that exists. But we've noticed that over time. So like when you look at that, the sort of like the first two steps of the funnel, like the number of people that we're getting and the number of people that we're sort of converting, we're ideally building up a bit of a feedback loop there where the people that are converting are bringing in more of their friends. And there's a sense of like, they believe in the product, they understand the product, they understand the people behind it, they understand kind of the philosophy, they understand the direction, roughly where this thing is going. A good indicator of this is a complete sidebar, I guess, is when we made the shift from CDK to Terraform and to Pulumi. It was a big shift. It's a religious level conflict, right? It's like it's a thing where, like I was sort of saying when I put the post out, there are obviously people that were unhappy about our take on it. But then on the flip side, we had people like our users that came to us sort of constantly, and this like is not sort of a made up thing. They were literally just like, I'm using your post to change people's minds within our company about this about this shift from CDK to Terraform. And so, again, maybe not a tactic is maybe not the right word, but I think it matters that you build up. In the SaaS world, I think it would be more branding as opposed to sort of following or community. Right. But there is this thing has to grow in a way that it makes it incrementally easier to add new people or add new users to your product, right? It's if you don't, then it gets really hard.
Yeah. Yeah, it fails to reach that critical mass,
Yeah.
so to speak. What's next for SST? You already made a big move by moving away from CloudFormation. Are things going to sort of settle down, stabilize for a while, or are there more big moves coming up?
I think in terms of sort of the underlying like technology or those, not as much, but it's allowed us to, both as a team and I think as a community, to sort of realize that now we can go out and pretty much hit our goal of quote unquote deploy anything. Like we had started with sort of just serverless, we started with just AWS. Now there's sort of Cloudflare in the mix. Now there's sort of a better story around containers. There's certainly a lot that we need to do sort of on the AI side as well. But what we're pretty much going to see, I think, most people will sort of see is that we're just going to add support for as many frameworks, for as many runtimes as possible over the next few weeks or so, and probably the next few months as well. So just growing it out, yeah.
I look forward to deploying my AI agent workflow on SST. Just when you say deploy anything, you invite, sort of hold my beer. I'm going to stress test this thing. Not that I drink beer, but I look forward to stress testing it, see what comes up.
Yeah.
Okay. Things change really fast, really, really fast, right? Especially in the JavaScript, TypeScript sort of web engineering space. What's the best way to stay updated, especially around serverless topics and SST? Are you just going to tell me to go on Twitter and follow a bunch of people, or do y'all have podcasts, RSS feeds, various resources that help you with that?
Yeah, this is interesting. Obviously, the dumb answer here is the Twitter one, but I think there's a point to that. It's just, I think what I've realized over the years maybe is having smart friends really helps. Just having people that
Amen.
tell you, hey, check this thing out, and you trust their opinion on a bunch of other things, helps cut through the noise quite a bit. There's the thing that you're obviously saying of, yeah, things change really quickly, but it's also just, there's just so much, right? There's just a lot of noise as well. Not noise in a bad way. It's just maybe it's not the right thing that you're looking for. And I think we've gotten good about this in terms of both just sort of friends, people that we know, but also cultivating a bit of a community. I think what's happened
from the framework.
Yeah. And even on Twitter as well, just having people that that you kind of trust their opinion on certain things, and when they point something out, that gives you more of an incentive. I'm sure you have this too, where you'll hear about something and you'll hear about it again, and then maybe on the third time it'll come from somebody that you really sort of care about, and you're like, all right, I need to go check it out. And so I think that's been sort of helpful in being conscious of the type of people that you get your information from.
That's so cool. So it's really just people. How you stay up to date is people. Have the right friend. There's a lot of older people when I was growing up told me, if you tell me who your 5 closest friends are, I'll tell you the kind of person you're going to be in 5 years.
Yeah.
And I believe that. In fact, you're absolutely right. When Astro was new and receiving all this traction, we should get Fred on the show. I saw a lot of hype. Everybody's rebuilding their website in Astro, but it wasn't until Una Kravitz from Google rebuilt her website in Astro, and I thought, oh, this is okay. I pay attention to what Una says, and then I went and rebuilt mine in Astro, and it was an absolute dream, to be honest.
Our docs are in Astro. Yeah,
y'all are using Starlight.
Yeah, we're using Starlight. Yeah.
Incredible, man. Elion. I don't know if you've interacted with Elion. Elion Van Cutsem he's the one of the maintainers of Astro,
I see.
And very, very involved with Starlight. We'll get him on the podcast also. Okay, I think we've talked in good enough depth and nuance around SST as a company. This is the founder and CEO series, and I'd love to, just for our last few minutes here, talk to you about that side of it, the founder, co-founder, CEO side. We in previous discussions, for example, with Matt from Netlify, talked about the early stages of founding this, and there was some really great insights here. And by the way, what I'm trying to do is cross-pollinate, get all of your ideas together and cook something, a mix of it, right? And so what Matt said was, when Netlify started, there was a big movement towards headless CMS, and he felt the need for Okay, but at some point, someone's going to need to think about the head to the headless CMS. And this is actually where Netlify came from. People are going to start thinking about, okay, I need some head, I need to deploy it, help. And so he started BitBalloon and then Netlify. In the beginning, there was resistance because it's nobody's going to need this. What are you talking about?
Right.
Was that something you and your co-founders faced with SST, where it was early days? You know, you mentioned it was when CDK just came out. It was early days. Were there instances, for example, where people were like, I don't get it. Maybe you shouldn't do it. It's not a good idea. Or what was it like when you were sort of pitching it to people in the early stages?
Yeah, I think this one, yeah, because we've come through sort of the serverless ecosystem, this was very sharp. Like very early on, like you post anything serverless related on Hacker News, you're going to get downvoted. Like it doesn't matter what you say. You could say serverless is terrible and you still get downvoted. But but it was just that when we had sort of launched, like that was kind of the thing, is that you're trying to almost like convince people that serverless is a thing. And I think the sort of Matt's story like kind of resonates, because if you're working on anything that is going to be, let's say, the next trend, there's no way it's going to be accepted right now. Like that's just, it's just the reality of it. Like if it's already in the air now, you're probably going to deal with a lot of competition.
It's maybe too late.
Yeah, maybe too late. Yeah. A lot of competition. Like I think this comes up quite a bit, is that like if you're starting sort of an AI company now, it's just fundamentally there are 5 other people doing the exact same thing, and not saying that it's a bad idea. It's just that is just the reality of it. So there's one camp, you deal with competition because the idea is already in the air, or there's the other camp, you're picking an idea that is being rejected or not in the air, and you're betting that it turns the tide in some ways. And so yeah, that was definitely a thing with us. Yeah.
How did you overcome it? And what was it? Just, I don't care what you think, I'm going to do my thing and prove you all wrong? Were there moments of like doubt, like maybe we are not doing the right thing here? And this is important because I asked Matt exactly the same question and he had an answer that I'll maybe tell you after, but I'm curious to hear yours.
Yeah. I think all of them, but there are, so as sort of technology folks, like there's, you're riding the wave on some level, so you're not independent of the landscape, and the landscape shifts. And so in the case of serverless, the first thing that sort of helped us was the landscape shifted in a way that every front end, before you sort of realize it, was using a Lambda function underneath.
Yeah.
And this is sort of like it's weirdly not all that much talked about, because front ends were just static files, like single page apps, right? Just like running on S3 buckets and some Cloudflare or CloudFront distribution. And when front end framework authors were like, we want to add some server related code, they weren't thinking we need to start up a Kubernetes cluster. They were thinking we're going to use a Lambda function, right? And so oddly, what happened was there were a bunch of detractors of serverless on the back end, and that continued. And that was a very hard fight to try and convince them. And so that's where some of these other things that you mentioned, like, yeah, we would question, are we doing kind of the right thing? Are we even in the right space? Like, is it even worth trying to change people's minds here? And then behind the scenes, this shift happened, and, we were like, well, we clearly see what the future is going to look like. These people are not going to go to containers. You're going to have just an enormous user base of front-end engineers that are going to be writing functions now. And that's just, that's just their reality. And so that's, if you look at kind of SST's history a little bit, we, at some point, we were more sort of back-end focused, and then we became a lot more front-end focused. And now what you sort of see as is kind of playing in a bit of both worlds. But yeah, that was sort of, if I sort of summarize again, it would be the underlying reality shifted a little bit. This is a running joke that we have on our Discord. It's just for our listeners. It's the Mac does this thing when you make certain gestures, it'll do it. And the first few times it happened, we just laughed so hard in our Discord, like internally, that I'm just like, I'm not going to turn it off anymore. I'm just going to leave it on. It's just so much fun.
Yeah.
Every time it happens, it catches me by surprise every time. Like I wasn't expecting to do that. Yeah, there we
Exactly.
go.
Here we are.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah, so to sort of summarize, I think the underlying reality shifted a little bit. There were just a bunch of people that started using serverless. They didn't care about your arguments of serverless and non-serverless. They were just doing it. And then on the other side, we kind of realized that it doesn't make sense to try and change people's minds. We should go to where the actual habits are being formed.
That is such an awesome takeaway. Wow. I've spoken to so many co-founders, and this resistance to new ideas is ubiquitous. It is everywhere. In fact, I spoke to one who said, I don't even care anymore. I'm not listening to, I don't care. I'm just doing my thing. People don't see it yet. That's not their fault. They just don't know. I'm just going to do my thing. He was so like hard about it. To reveal Matt's answer, Matt said, there's a right time. There's a right time to get feedback. And when your idea is way too abstract, that is not the right time. So he was like, with Netlify, I'm going to like make it a little bit more concrete and then show it to people and then get the feedback. And so through our discussion, what we uncovered was if you're getting a lot of pushback, it may be worth making your idea a little bit more concrete and then inviting more feedback and keep going. And then if your idea is like a full-blown product and it's still being rejected, well, then you've failed, right? So finding the right time. But I love what you said. Go to where the habits are formed and be in that ecosystem. This is so great. I mean, I work with, like, for example, a company, Towery. Towery is an open source project for making desktop apps. It's very similar to Electron, but it's in Rust. And it's very different because Electron will ship you like Chromium and Node.js, like two massive runtimes. Right. And Towery doesn't do any of that. It just ships like Rust. That's it. And so it's smaller and faster, but in some arenas, there's pushback, especially in the JavaScript space. Is like, why do I need this? Sure, it's smaller and lighter, but I don't want to learn Rust. And so your advice here of like go to where the habits are in use, and those people will see the value because they don't know any better. I think that's so cool. Thank you for sharing that. I also see some parallels between the pushback you received from the serverless folks and the pushback some people are seeing in the AI space, right? And I wonder if it's similar. I wonder if the serverless or the people who decided serverless is not the way and everything's going to be containers, if those folks just felt threatened. Because at some point, it becomes less relevant if the zeitgeist moves more to functions, right? That probably also was an element.
Yeah.
Do you agree? Am I way off here?
Yeah. No. This resistance thing is interesting because, as engineers, like I was trying to dig into like why. For a while, I was sort of very curious about why people are so anti-serverless in some of these cases, and when you like. There's a hint of what you're sort of saying there. When you really think about it, it's like let's say you're an engineer on a team. Maybe you're maybe the junior engineer. You're just sort of starting out. You're a mid-level engineer. Let's say that, and somebody senior in your team decides they want to use the serverless thing, and it's being pushed on you, and you've tried it, and it's not fun, or like you've had a hard time with it. Like your personal experience was not great with it. You don't have a choice in some ways. Like you go find a new job. Like it's not a good space to be. Like it's not like as a founder or like, as an indie hacker, you can pick whatever stack you want. Nobody's going to tell you what to do. You don't like the tool, you like switch it out. But when you're in a larger organization, these decisions are somehow like sometimes made for you, and I can see why there's so much resistance sometimes because they feel threatened that their way of like their day-to-day is going to be affected by somebody else's decision. So I like empathize with that completely, which is another big reason why we were like, well, let's just go to the place where people are already using it, and then it's a much easier sell, not just to them, but to other folks like, oh, you're already using it in that area. Why don't you try it for some other things?
That is so cool. And that's also where I am. So I have played in many arenas. I've deployed things with Terraform. I know my way around EKS enough to do Kubernetes if I want to. But honestly, it's the same. I recently, today actually, at the time of recording, released a CLI tool that you just like you prompt it. You run the command and you just go like, how do I convert this video to a GIF? And you hit enter, and using a large language model, it'll give you the right command, and you run it then and there. And I shared this, and someone was like, why don't you just use? I think it's called Handbrake. It's a GUI macOS application that does the same thing.
Right.
And I said, I don't want to install a GU, like a native
Yeah.
Mac app with a GUI. I just want to use my terminal because I'm right there. So
Right.
if I can extrapolate a little bit, going to where the users already are,
Yeah.
even through a CLI over a UI,
Yeah.
is I think a really great takeaway. Okay. As we close, I wanted to ask. So I've been doing this with all of the founders, all of the CEOs. There doesn't exist. In the web we have like living standards. We have HTML.
Yep.
We have fetch. We have these things that are they're standards. They're documents of how a thing should work, what to expect. Founders and CEOs don't have this.
Right.
And I was wondering if we could look into a crystal ball and imagine a little bit if such a document existed. From your experience, what do you think should be on there? Past guests have mentioned things like everything changes so fast. The ground keeps changing under you constantly, and you have to be adaptable, for example. The economy could go bad. What do you do then? Maybe some competitor almost starts to eat you, and then you pivot. So adaptability to change has been one thing that people mentioned is sort of universal as the founder CEO struggle. I'm curious if you have some salient features that you face that maybe should go in such a specification.
I think a more recent one for us, and again, this maybe again like touches on how we are. We're a very small team. We're 3 people. Because a decent chunk of my time goes into thinking about this. It's figuring out like the sort of form of communication that allows anybody on the team to work in their sort of best way possible, or like in their sort of like the phrase I keep coming back to is like their base case. Like, what is their normal mode of operation? So I'll give you an example. You meet somebody for the first time at a meetup. You're obviously not yourself immediately, right? It takes a while before you settle into a conversation. You're like, all right, now I sort of understand. But even then, like, you're not like 100% there. And that is something that I think about a lot in terms of when it comes to building teams is how do you get to that sort of best case of operation between people as quickly as possible. And I think you can be sort of intentional about doing these things. And there's obviously some forces that act against your favor. So like, setting up sort of like a reporting structure, or like setting up sort of like clear lines of communication between certain people sort of hampers that a little bit. So this is kind of a big one for me, is that when you think about high performing teams, it's obviously the simple phrase here is they need to be on the same page, but there's just so much value in getting people on the same page. And a way this sort of shows up is we, as a team, we almost never have disagreements. Like we have things that our initial opinions might differ, but we converge very quickly. And the reason for that is just over time, like we've spent a lot of time getting to this place where we are on the same page about things. And again, like the metaphor here would be like, you just want to make sure everybody's rowing in the same direction. And I think we undervalue what that is. Like there is not just same direction, but it's also with the same amount of effort, right? Like there's a case where like people are feeding off of each other. Like there's clearly the sense of energy and so again, I think the big thing for me, if I was to put something down on the document, is how do you get your team performing at its best ability? In the scope of a startup, I think this matters because ultimately every single startup is a bet, and you want to walk away thinking you gave it your best shot, right? And
Yeah.
As a team, you want to feel that. And if you've talked to almost anybody that's either worked at a startup in the past or has gone through maybe a not so pleasant experience, they come away with regrets. Almost everybody. They're like, I wish we had tried this. I wish the leadership had listened to us. Like I wish like they looked at what our users were saying, right? Like there's always regrets in terms of like there's like this thing that you could have done. And the biggest thing in my head is like, how can we walk away thinking, you know what, we actually gave it our best shot, right? Like that this was the best we could have done.
That's awesome. So it's highly focused on people and serving people so well that they bring their best to work every
Yeah.
day in terms of not just direction but effort. I'm curious if we could speak to like the practicalities of that, especially because this seems to occupy like 80%
Yeah.
of your mind space. So if I went to Dax and I said, "Hey, what is your base case?" How would one express, I guess, their base case in this scenario?
Yeah, so it's interesting because human beings are just wired in a way that like if you ask them directly, it doesn't
Yeah.
happen. Like we're
Yeah.
just like that. It's just it takes a while before you sort of like build the trust. But there is something to that in that like when we try and communicate, I try and get it to a point where I really understand what you're actually saying. And
Yeah.
this is so weird because it's like you would think we're like technical people. We should know these things. Like we're you know we're like precise, but turns out we're not. You know, like even for
Yeah.
technical matters, we're not precise, right? Um and a lot of this is also because we have these norms. So we kind of think about let's say me, for example. If I'm speaking out in my head, I'm going, well, I need to make a very good and sound argument here, right? And so I hold back a bunch of what I would have normally otherwise said because I want to
Yeah.
make this like better argument. And as a result, I'm actually communicating less. And so in some of these things, like going back to like your example here, like so if I was to approach that, it would be, hey Dax, in my head I'm going, I want to figure out what his sort of base case is, and it's going to take me time to figure it out. But it's a thing that I'm going to work on, over time. So
Yeah.
this is a thing that I do individually. And again, like immediately when you're hearing this, you're going, well, this is not going to scale. And I think that on some level is the point, is that high performing teams are
Yeah.
smaller in nature. Like you never think of like 1,000-person team as like a massive high performance engine. You think of like sports teams as high performance teams, and so yeah. So there's just a level that I think if you've been in one of these, it. Like you'll get to a point where you're just like, I just trust everybody around me, and I can do my work without like thinking about it. Like my brain is not occupied with, oh, what's this other person going to think about what we're going to do?
Yeah.
And like, like there's all these things are just gone. And at the end of the day, it's like, there's like this purity when it comes to the product that you're working on.
Yeah. Yeah. You said very many interesting things there, about the highest performing teams really being small teams. There's this old African proverb, right? I think it's by the Ubuntu people, not the Linux distribution, but the tribe, where they say if you wanna go far, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And this sort of implies, like, if you're a small team, you will probably go very fast, as you mentioned, high performing. I assume that's what that means. But if you want to go long and last forever, sort of like the large companies, like where I've worked, for example, Spotify, 4,500 employees.
Yep.
They can do that because there's so many people, and they can probably last that long because at some point you grow. And
Yep.
like I feel like VCs also put this pressure on you to grow in terms of like valuation, but also oftentimes you'll just reach your end like, we're 3 people, we can't. We need to do the work of finding a new person and then deciphering their mysterious base case, right?
Right.
Which you mentioned is not something you can just ask, but I guess the protocol, if I'm listening to you, is I come to work every day, I talk to you, I sort of, if we were dogs, I'd be like sniffing your butt in a safe for work way. I don't know where that went, but yeah, it's just building familiarity. It sounds like interesting. Okay.
Well, and I think it goes sort of both ways. So like again, like the most obvious thing here really is just like, you're just trying to make sure you actually understand the person, and you're creating a space where the person is able to say these things. Say unfinished thoughts, I guess, is another way of sort of putting it. Like I don't need
Beautiful.
you to tell me like, like again, like this well-reasoned argument for why we should do a certain thing or not. It could literally just be like, I feel weird about doing this thing. And then that's a good enough thing for me to be like, well, I want to know why. Like that's kind of interesting because maybe I've been thinking about it or somebody else has been. And then if you do that enough, then eventually you get to a point where everybody's kind of on the same page.
Yeah. It's interesting because there has to be like compatibility there, because If somebody
Yes.
says, I'm not sure about this, and there's no familiarity, then the other person gets defensive, right?
Yep.
Like, oh, why are you questioning me? I thought we were supposed to be a team. I've
Yep.
seen that happen a
Yep.
lot. So, yeah, I guess the antidote here is make sure there's familiarity to where you can then voice those unfinished thoughts.
Yep.
And
Yep.
and don't make the mistake, because I've made that mistake, Jay. Like earlier in my career, I just felt really comfortable in most environments, as I do today on the podcast. And I used to just have like express unfinished thoughts all the time, and people just thought I was dumb,
Right.
and they didn't
Right.
like me.
Right.
And so yes,
Or they
I hear
form
what you're saying.
opinions based on that, right? Because like the first words that come out of my mouth are the ones that I'm going to form my opinion on you. And if it's an unfinished thought, it's going to be an unfinished opinion. Like it's going to be like, I don't know. It doesn't seem like he knows what
Yeah.
he's talking about.
Yeah,
So
it's also going to seem like this person doesn't think.
Doesn't
this
think,
person
yes.
doesn't think it through.
it's not intentional.
And
Yeah.
that's going right, and that's going to be your opinion. So incredible. Thank you. I'm going to use that. I actually learned a lesson either last year or this year. This is the lesson I learned, that the way you say things matters. And I knew this, of course.
Right,
I
yes.
studied communication and so on,
Yep.
but like you have to bring your best self in the beginning when you're not so familiar. And I've seen cases where this disintegrates really badly over time, where you develop so much familiarity that suddenly you're saying like red pill problematic
Right.
stuff because you feel so comfortable with people, because the true
Right.
you comes out. The problem is the true you is a horrible person.
Right.
And so you've got to also be decent and then be real. And I think that will help.
Yeah.
In any case,
Yeah. I
did,
think
do you have
just-
something to add here?
Yeah. Just to sort of finish there, like, you know, we don't do this because that's the goal. It's that
Yeah.
100% of the focus needs to be on the product. And I think there's
Yes.
something interesting that you said about like the sort of Spotify, like a 4,000 person team. It's like for you to get there, like startups, they're a little bit like rockets. You need to hit escape velocity. Most of them are just going to crash and burn. Like 90% of them are just going to crash and burn. Hitting escape velocity is kind of what matters. And going back to the other point I was making of the sort of no regrets thing, you want to be in a situation where you feel like you gave it your 100% as a team, right?
Yes.
And so that's kind of where this all sort of leads to, is that are we creating an environment where we're giving 100% of our shot to hit escape velocity?
Incredible. And not just to hit escape velocity, but to do so, while honoring each
Right.
other and making sure nobody burns out and so on. With that, listen, Jay, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. You've contributed so much. I mean, from the technical deep dives of moving from CDK and the background behind Ion and all of the technical, deeply complex topics, to the sides of running a business and having grit in the face of rejection and so on. On behalf of me and all the listeners, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining my discussion with JV. I hope you found it as insightful as I did, especially when the parts about CDK, Pulumi, Terraform, and how SST fits into that landscape and how it may be better. If you'd like to give it a try, I'd recommend going to SST.dev. If you're learning from and or enjoying this content, then a great way to support the channel at no cost, if you're watching on YouTube, is to subscribe and leave a like on the video. If you're listening on Apple and or Spotify, you can leave up to a 5-star review. That really helps. And also, of course, sharing any of this on social media will help make it more discoverable if you think it should be. Thank you so much for being a part of the podcast. Thank you so much for joining the discussion. And most importantly, thank you for your interest in engineering.